excited to participate and to be able to present to the group. And so at this point, I'm actually going to turn it over to my colleague, Susan, to give you a little bit of an overview of Detroit Future City, which is the home of land and waterworks, but also the hub of a ton of work in the green stormwater infrastructure space here in the city of Detroit. Susan?
Thanks, Nicole. If we can flip to the next slide. Next. Great. So we just wanted to start off by giving you guys a little bit of background about Detroit Future City as an organization. DFC is a nonprofit.
Wait, I want Twyla to play with. Can you get her set up with?
Thanks. So we're a nonprofit that was formed to implement the Detroit Strategic Framework Plan, which is what you're looking at here, which was released in 2012. This effort began in 2010 after the financial crash, and Detroit found itself trying to meet short-term needs, but also wanting to use that time as an opportunity to actually create a long-term plan for the city. So if you could go to the next slide. This strategic framework plan was created with a huge community engagement process, over 163,000 interactions with stakeholders across the city, nation, and globe to actually create a more holistic vision for the city. There was actually a brick and mortar building that was set up to invite folks to just walk in and look at what was going on, give their opinions and feedback to get incorporated into this plan. So after it was released in 2012, the Detroit Strategic Framework Plan, our implementation office is what we were called at first, which then morphed into Detroit Future City. We were created as kind of a quasi-governmental organization, and then in 2016, we spun off as our own nonprofit. So under this plan, if you go to the next slide, there's a few different topics that are tackled, and the ones we're going to be talking about today are land use and land and building assets. And those two approaches to planning are what our specific team at DFC tackles. So our team is the land use and sustainability team, and our goals are to advance and scale up open space land transformation and green stormwater infrastructure implementation through a range of different tactics. If you could go to the next slide. Public-private partnerships, technical assistance, resource development, policy change, and network building. So under our land use and sustainability team, we kind of look at this big goal of having 24 square miles of vacant land in the city. And that's just the land without structures. So if you actually include the vacant land with structures, it's over 40 plus square miles. And if you want to jump to the next slide. This amount of land is just such a huge amount for such a big city like Detroit. And oftentimes this land is mowed by the city approximately twice a year, sometimes less. And it's often blighted, and it's become kind of a barrier to neighborhood stabilization, safety, all kinds of different things. But at Detroit Future City, we look at this as an actual awesome opportunity that such a major city like Detroit has to actually activate and transform that land into a public benefit. And that's what our land use and sustainability team aims to do in partnership with a lot of other folks in Detroit on the ground, actually doing the work of transforming this land. And then also so this was actually just released yesterday, I believe. We have a new Center of Equity, Engagement, and Research at Detroit Future City, and we frame all of our work in the lens of equity in Detroit. It definitely frames how we think about mitigating and adapting to climate change. And it definitely drives all of our work with GSI across the city. So we have a few different programs under our land use and sustainability team. If you can flip to the next slide. So the one we're going to mainly be talking about today is the Land and Waterworks Coalition that Nicole manages, which is an educational outreach program to Detroiters to achieve the green culture shift, as we like to call it. And there's a bunch of different pilot projects and research projects and outreach activities underneath that coalition that we're going to talk about. And then there's a couple other programs that we want to touch on if we have time that we do to actually scale up GSI across the city. to combat climate change. So I will let Nicole take it away from here to tell you all about the coalition.
Right. Thank you so much, Susan. So as Susan mentioned, we are not the only organization working on addressing stormwater management and climate change in the city of Detroit. So the Land and Water Works Coalition is a collaborative of 10 different organizations as well as resident voice. And so the members that you see here really impact change in this work from the point of water stewardship, land stewardship, engagement of faith-based community, urban agriculture, as well as engaging our community development, community as well too. Next slide, please. This work is not something that we're able to do alone, and we engage many different partners at the table to be able to help us move this work forward. So obviously there are a number of departments that are critical to this work that we work with within our city government. So we work obviously with our water and sewage department, but we also work very closely with a newly established Office of Sustainability. We also work closely with our General Services Division, which manages our park system. Then we also work with another agency called the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, which is a quasi-public-private economic development corporation here in the city of Detroit. We also work with a network of research universities. And then we also work with community partners such as Cody Rouge Alliance and other nonprofits who are working in the sustainability space, such as the Nature Conservancy. And then in Detroit, most of the green stormwater infrastructure work that is funded by philanthropy is funded by a smaller family-run foundation, the Fred and Barbara Erb Family Foundation. Next slide, please. And so to give you a little bit of background around Land and Water Works, we were really convened originally out of a working group of our funder to address an emerging issue around Detroit's drainage-free restructure back in 2015. And the talk began, that was coming out in 2015. And so when we were convened in 2017, at first our mission was just to educate people around that and separate fact from fiction. But what we slowly began to realize is it was absolutely critical in getting people to understand why their drainage charge, why they were now being charged for drainage, why it was being called out, really looking at why it was important for us to be able to manage our stormwater and to manage combined sewage overflows. And so for the last 3 years, we have been working to engage community, the private sector and the public sector in this conversation and really looking at the role that we all play in managing these events, which are only increasing due to climate change, not just happening in Detroit, but across the country. Next slide, please. And so when we look at the work that we do, we really look at it through this lens of equity, as Susan mentioned earlier. And so for us, we really envision a resilient Detroit where green stormwater infrastructure helps to be able to mitigate not only the impacts of climate change, but also looking at how does it really truly improve the quality of life for all residents. And so what does that really look like for us? It looks like a city full of environmental stewards who are really looking at how do we take advantage of our natural assets to be able to protect them, but also looking at how we're doing this in an equitable way to be able to make our city more climate resilient, but also looking at how do these practices result in what we call our triple bottom line. So how do they benefit a community socially, environmentally, as well as economically? Next slide, please. And so we want to give you a little bit of a context around the challenge around Detroit. And it's really a land of challenges as well as opportunities when it comes to tackling climate change and stormwater management. Next slide, please. So many of you all probably already know this, but we like to explain it for people just in case they don't. So many people think that stormwater and rain are the exact same thing when they are actually not. Rain is amazing, it's good, we all need it. However, stormwater is bad, and it can be very bad like it is in the case of Detroit. And so stormwater basically occurs when that beautiful rain hits our hard surfaces or impervious land cover, and then whatever is on that ground is then carried into our stormwater system. And then in the case of Detroit, because we have a combined sewage system, when the system is at capacity, it then flows into one of two places, into Rouge River or into the Detroit River, which happens to be our drinking water source. Next slide, please. And so Susan touched on this a little bit. So we are a city of 139 square miles, 24 of which is currently vacant. But given that out of that 139 square miles, 42% of our city is impervious acreage. And so much like every other major city, we experienced quite the development boom and population boom from the early 1900s until the mid 1960s. And so with that, you began to see increases in our CSO overflows. Next slide, please. And so our system is not unlike the system of, for those of you all who live in New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Cincinnati, St. Louis. Most of us all have the same sort of combined sewage overflow system, in which on a good day when it's sunny out, which hopefully it is for many of you all, there's not an issue. The wastewater treatment plants can handle the flow of the sanitary water and the wastewater that's coming into the system without any problem. But when you have days, which we're having more of these once in 100 year storms that are becoming much more frequent, when we're having more of the 2 year 24-hour storms, which are increasingly becoming more frequent. And in addition, looking at the crazy hurricane season that we're experiencing this year, this system then becomes a problem. In the city of Detroit, we have already spent $1.5 billion trying to resolve this problem by building 9 CSO treatment facilities, and we are still not capturing all of the stormwater runoff. Next slide, please. And so an example of this, and where we're starting to see more and more of these events, and it really came to a head for many people, for many Detroiters and our suburban neighbors, was one of those once in 100 year storms that we experienced in 2014, which is, we haven't had one that has been as bad, but we have had numerous storms that have been close to it. So with that storm, it rained almost 5 inches that day in just 10 hours. So you think about that, you're like, oh, that's not a lot. But when you're concentrating it in 10 hours, that amount of rain becomes quite an issue. And so with that, it's spurned over 10 billion gallons of just raw sewage overflow into the Detroit and Rouge rivers. It also was a very costly climate event. So it caused over $1 billion in damage. It also resulted in a $7.2 million cleanup of our freeway system, in which most of you all know our infrastructure systems are severely underfunded. So you're adding on climate change events, which can send states into a tailspin of looking at how do they pay for the cleanup and recapture that money into their budgets for just operations. But also with that, it resulted in the loss and federal aid having to come in and cover $61 million in losses to our local small business economy. Next slide, please. So what does 10 billion gallons of stormwater runoff look like? 86 football fields filled up to the goal line. So next slide, please. So in Detroit, that would be 86 versions of Ford Field, where sadly, most of the times our Lions go to lose every Sunday, even during this virtual season. Next slide, please. So when we look at why is this all important, we understand that water is perhaps one of the most precious assets that we have. And Detroit is in such a unique situation, is that we are a direct feeder into Lake Erie with the Detroit River and Rouge rivers, which are part of the Great Lakes system, which encompass 1/3 of the world's fresh surface water. So whatever goes into our river, we know impacts not just Detroiters, but it impacts everyone in the Great Lakes region and the Great Lakes Basin region. And so just to give some context, with all the development that was taking place, all the population growth, it resulted in a number of dead waterways in the mid 1960s. So many people know about the Cuyahoga River fire in the mid 1960s. Well, our Rouge River also caught on fire and was officially declared a dead river. So in the early 1970s, as all of you all know, the Environmental Protection Agency was created, and shortly thereafter, Clean Water Act was created. And so out of that, required cities to be able to manage CSO overflows control the pollution that was going into their waterways and really began to hold them and hold industry accountable for protecting the health of our waterways. Next slide, please. So in the city of Detroit in 1977, like many other cities, we were placed under a consent decree by the EPA and with our local state environmental agency. Here in Michigan, it's called the Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy Agency. And so under that consent decree, Detroit was tasked with getting to 0 CSOs. Most other cities across the country had to fall somewhere between 5% and 2%. Currently, with the $1.5 billion investment at a current annual operating rate of $150 million for those CSO facilities, we've been able to capture 96% of the stormwater runoff that happens in CSO events. However, that being said, in 2017, we still had 722 million gallons of stormwater runoff go into our Detroit River. Next slide, please. Susan?
So to give you guys a little, can you hear me okay? To give you a little more context on the water and sewerage department in Detroit, there are 3 different programs that they've put in place. So there's the drainage charge, which is another word for stormwater fee that I'm sure a lot of you guys have across the country. And then they've also been putting into place a green infrastructure program and then another post-construction stormwater ordinance. So I know a lot of other cities already have ordinances in place for development requiring GSI, but now Detroit does as well. And then the drainage charge is our stormwater fee. If you could go to the next slide. They rolled this out in 2015 and 2016. And before that, most people were not getting charged for stormwater, or if they were, it was kind of distributed to customers all in a bunch of different ways. So either some people weren't receiving it at all, or some people were receiving it as a small percentage of their water bill, their water meter charge, or some people were being charged by impervious acreage. So it was kind of different across the board. And then in 2016, they actually started calling it out as a line item and they started charging everyone the same. So if you can go back actually, right now, oops, we're going for it. There we go. So right now we're under this rate of $626 per impervious acre a month. So if you have 1 acre of impervious surface on your property, you're being charged $626 a month or $7,500 a year. So for a lot of people like the faith-based community and nonprofits and small businesses, this new charge of, and a lot of people have more than 1 acre of impervious surface, especially there's so many churches in Detroit with these big parking lots. So they now have, tens of thousands of dollars in stormwater fees each year. This has really been hitting them hard. So we've been, Nicole's been doing the good fight of doing the educational work to let people know what the drainage charge is. And then we've also been trying to help people implement green infrastructure in order to lower this drainage charge. So if you can go to the next slide, this kind of just shows the breakdown of the green infrastructure program that our water and sewage department has put in place. So basically 20%, you're always going to pay 20% of your drainage fee. But if you're implementing green stormwater infrastructure, you can get up to 80% of your drainage charge removed. You can get a green credit for up to 80% of that charge. So if you're managing the 100-year storm for all of the impervious surface on your property, you can actually get an 80% reduction in that fee. So if you go one more. So GSI, for those who are not familiar, maybe probably no one on this call, but it's a more natural way to manage stormwater than just our gray infrastructure system. So we're looking at a big rain garden that the water department built on the west side of Detroit. And you can actually go to 2 slides. So you can go to the next one. Go ahead, Nicole.
Yeah, thank you. So our job is to look at how do we create a more resilient Detroit for all Detroiters, right? And so we do this in a couple of days. We do this by focusing in our work on engagement and education, looking at how are we able to strengthen our neighborhoods by utilizing GSI, how do we create an environment where we're able to scale up these practices, and then also how with all of these things are we able to weave together a network of neighborhoods that really create a climate resilient city of Detroit. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, our program has been in existence for just over 3 years, and we have done a lot of work to get to reach over 34,000 people. So with this, we have an ambassador program in which we've trained over 105 resident leaders and nonprofits to be able to really be neighborhood level experts when it comes to land and water stewardship, CSO, combined sewage overflows prevention, and also having them have and training them with the hands-on experiences to be able to go out there and not just to educate people about it, but to also go out there and install some of these practices on their own. We also, as a baseline to being able to create our program, developed a curriculum to help demystify everything that we all talk about within our bubbles, to be able to make it something that is palatable and understandable to the average citizen. We also believe in working with community partners to be able to ensure that they are engaging in the information by practicing it using a hands-on model. So we do that with a rain gardens program that we are going to talk about in a little bit. And then we also started our program with a summit and a series of forums where we were able to bring information out to residents in the neighborhoods where they lived and bring not only our utility partners to be able to engage with them on site in their communities, but also resources so that they're not having to always struggle to find resources to be able to implement a lot of these projects that we are discussing with them, but having the opportunity to meet with contractors and other support programs in that area. And then we also realized in our second year of our event is that we were starting to talk to the masses. We were talking to the people who are already sort of kind of bought in, who kind of understood that there was a need to focus on water quality and health. But we needed to reach out and we needed to be able to engage people in different manners. And so that included everything from bike tours throughout the city, tours of tree and native plant nurseries, a plastics-free July celebration in which we talked about like the polluting through trash and litter and PFAS and microplastics in our water systems. And so again, over the last 3 years, we've reached 34,000 people, a little over 34,000 people with this work. Next slide, please. So to give you a little bit of a breakdown, more of a breakdown around our ambassadors. And so with that 105, we trained 70 amazing residents in all 7 council districts across the city of Detroit to be able to go out and engage their fellow residents and family members and friends and get them engaged around the topics of land and water stewardship and really be able to provide a holistic education, peer-to-peer style that goes beyond what we were finding in our initial days of operation, where conversations would only focus on water shutoffs, which Detroit still struggles with. And at one time, we had a height of over 10,000 water shutoffs a year. And then we also were struggling with people focusing in also on just lead poisoning in water because of the Flint water crisis. But we wanted to make sure that we're engaging people in all the other many shades of conversation that have to take place when you're discussing water health. We've engaged 35 nonprofits, so that's everyone from Black clubs, patrols to larger art institutions, and looking at how they communicate about this work with the populations that they serve, and also with their peer organizations as well too. And so each year they've been tasked with the goal of reaching just 10,000 people. And in the way our program has worked, our public facing work kicked off in 2018, and consistently each year our ambassadors have consistently delivered our highest outreach numbers of any programming that we manage. And obviously COVID has been a little bit different, but they've been really creative in how they've been able to engage people, whether they've been small COVID safe outdoor demonstrations to tons of virtual learning opportunities. And we also provide for them not only pay positions for them to compensate them for their volunteer time, but we have also awarded this group of amazing folks over $82,000 in mini grants, which have resulted in products such as a children's book around green stormwater infrastructure that follows a beaver around Detroit that tells the kids about climate change and the importance of the river and what GSI is, to a traveling art installation project that highlighted green stormwater infrastructure, CSOs, and everything in between. And so we're really excited that we're equipping residents with the tools necessary to really serve as true peer-to-peer leaders and educators in their community, because even as organizations, we know that our residents best know how to engage with each other. And all that we need to do is really focus in on how do we give them the tools to be able to speak to their friends and neighbors. Next slide, please. We also, as I mentioned before, focus in on demonstration plantings. And so we worked with partners to be able to do a series of workshops at 9 different sites across the city, in which those sites were able to sign up through an application process and be awarded a rain garden that qualifies for Detroit Water and Sewage credit as part of the Grant Credit Program that Susan mentioned earlier. But the workshop piece of it really allowed us to be able to engage community surrounding that site and introduce them to the role that rain gardens can play, native plants can play, and helping to manage stormwater, also teaching disconnection of downspouts. They also were able to help design their own rain garden. So we got a chance to really give them a deeper dive education around what makes a rain garden different from a typical garden. And they learned how to maintain it, but then there was also a larger community planting day for each of these sites. And so we know that through this model, it leads to a the greater likelihood of long-term maintenance and continued successful operation of those sites. Next, please. We also believe in engaging every level of citizenry, and that includes our youth, right? Because all the work that we're doing is great, but we know we're setting the stage and setting the table for the young people who are going to be taking over this work. Some a little sooner than others. And so this year we started a youth environmental leadership program this summer, partnering with summer employment agencies who are working specifically with youth. And so as part of their program, we engaged them on a series of 5 Friday workshops in which young people were introduced to these concepts of land and water stewardship, and really couching it in topics that were just not lecturing them about, why GSI is important, but we wanted to tackle topics that were near and dear to their heart, but also in things that they could immediately relate to. So given the climate that we're in now in Detroit, also suffering from many environmental justice issues, we kicked off our series with a global perspective of land and water stewardship, but then quickly narrowed it down to a session where they learn from environmental justice leaders around issues that directly impact them from our environment on their level. We also educated them around air quality issues. In the city of Detroit, we have 2 of the worst for asthma in the entire country. And we also provided them workshops on water policy as well too. And then lastly, we provided an opportunity for them to get creative and hosted a GSI photography contest in which their work was displayed for the entire month of August. Next slide, please. And then I'm going to turn this over to Susan, but another big part of what we do is not just the education and the installation, but is really about grounding our work in research and really looking at how do we develop best practices to really provide the groundwork for us to be able to make the case to advocate for increased spending, increased funding around green stormwater infrastructure, as well as looking at how do we set the stage to make it easier for those small businesses, faith-based institutions, and nonprofits to be able to implement it here in the city of Detroit. Susan?
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, so like Nicole said, we've learned a lot from installing GSI practices in the city through Land and Waterworks, as well as a couple of our other programs. And what we realized was that the guides that have been published by the water department are not super user-friendly. They're difficult to really understand, even for myself as an engineer. And so I can't imagine a resident could pick something up like that and really understand what the process is on a basic level. So what we did is created a more user-friendly guide for non-residential property owners in Detroit to install bioretention. So instead of doing the whole breadth of GSI, we chose bioretention because we found it's the most cost-effective practice in Detroit, as well as we have, again, so much vacant land, so it makes sense to utilize that. But really, it can apply to different types of GSI practices. The process is pretty much the same, but it lays out from the very beginning of deciding if your site works for GSI, down to how to design for GSI, how to choose a contractor, how to apply for the credits to receive on your bill. And yeah, if you can go to the next slide. This just kind of shows you a couple pages from the book, but we really just wanted to create something that, you know, our goal is to really put the tools in the hands of residents to actually go out and do these projects and equip them with the best resources in order to install GSI throughout the city. If you can go to the next slide. We also do a range of pilot projects, and this is one of them. So last year we partnered with a resource center and church on the west side who had this massive parking lot, and they have already installed a bunch of rain gardens around their building to manage the stormwater coming from the building, but they still had this huge parking lot that it just wasn't going to be cost effective to install green infrastructure. And it also is in really bad shape. It's deteriorating, it's huge, and it only fills up like once a year on Christmas. And they also have abundant street parking. So they have been talking to us, and we were like, you know what, let's do a depaving pilot project here. So maybe you guys have heard about other depave organizations across the country, but we partnered with Depave Portland to kind of learn from their guide and all of their projects, and we went about this here. So we partnered with the Detroit Training Center in order to incorporate a workforce development component into this project. So they have a heavy operator equipment training program where they train Detroit residents how to operate heavy equipment, and they brought their equipment and their students out, and they got to have hands-on experience for their students, and we got to have donated labor for depaving 7,500 square feet of asphalt. So because they were depaving that much pavement, we were able to just completely get rid of that impervious area that they were being charged for the drainage charge. And then we also turned that into a landscaped beautiful green space, and we're going to be planting trees. So aside from like our traditional bioretention practices, we also wanted to do some more innovative, creative ways to help people save on the drainage charge and activate and create green space in their community. Next. And then another research piece that we put a lot of work into was this GSI Workforce Assessment. So we wanted to examine what the market for green jobs would be from all of this activity with GSI in our region. If you can go to the next slide. So we partnered with Mass Economics to model out, you know, all of the different pieces and see how Detroit fits. See how Detroit fits into the green jobs situation and how different levels of investment could affect that. So it's a lot to kind of explain in one slide, but we ended up using this data to model different levels of investment and then use that to make policy recommendations to practitioners and policymakers in our city to make a more equitable GSI space in Detroit. So we are trying to move that forward in a myriad of different ways through our different policy recommendations, but I think we're going to leave it at that. That's like the Land and Waterworks Coalition in a nutshell. And yeah, we'd be super happy to take any questions and then do some discussion.
Nicole and Susan, thank you so much. This is a lot of information to take in, and it's amazing work.